So now actually getting to the actual topic, Bibles. The first thing I would always recommend is having multiple translations of the Bible. How many here have more than one translation of the Bible at home? Do you? What other translations do you have?
I was going to say the internet, but
Then you have them all.
yeah.
All right, you have them all. Okay. Yeah, we should all have all translations because they're all on the, just go to BibleGateway.com, right? All right, so use multiple translations of the Bible. A variety of linguistic, ideological approaches have been used for translation within the Bible translation community. These are common categorized as dynamic equivalent, formal equivalent, and idiomatic or paraphrase. So right here, these are three, depending on which Bible translation you have, it was translated using three different methods: dynamic, formal, or paraphrase. And what this is saying is that translators went to the original Greek, translated to English, and they used one of these three translation methods: dynamic, formal, or paraphrase. Dynamic would be something like the NIV. Who has an NIV here? You have an NIV, right? You have an NIV? Okay, so dynamic equivalent is saying that the translators look at the original Greek, the original language, and they said, how can we best translate it to English where the reader could best understand it? It sounds more natural when they translate it. When you read the NIV, I don't know if you noticed, it sounds more like the way you would talk every day, talk. Now, if you read the New American Standard Bible, which is the one that Claes has, that uses formal equivalent, meaning they translated word for word from the original Greek, word for word. And sometimes that's a little bit more complicated. It's hard to understand. Sounds like they say more wooden, like it just doesn't sound like a natural person would speak. But if you're doing deep Bible study, that's the kind of Bible you want, because that's going to go more back to the original language. And then paraphrase would be something like the Message, which I don't recommend. It's one that just goes completely off to the side and just translates it like, it just changes everything. It has nothing to do with the original. You guys know what a paraphrase is, right?
You word
Right.
like a sentence
So you change all the words, say it with, you just basically say it a complete different way. It means the same thing, but you just say it differently. So dynamic equivalence and formal equivalence. Dynamic equivalence and formal equivalence are two dissimilar translation techniques that are used to reach different levels of literality between the original and target language of a text. Both techniques are used in biblical translation. The two terms have been understood primarily as translation of sense for meaning, translating the meaning of a phrase or complete sentence, and word-by-word translation, translating meaning of words and phrases into a more literal method. Formal equivalence tends to emphasize fidelity to the lexical details and the grammatical structure of the original language, while dynamic equivalence tends to employ a more natural representation but with less literal precision. To simplify what I just said, dynamic is the NIV, sounds more natural when you read it. The NASB, the New American Standard Version, sounds more wooden, doesn't sound as natural because it's translating from the original word for word. So, and here we have a list of different translations, formal equivalence translations. So we have, on the left side, we have Spanish Bibles, and on the right side, we have English Bibles. And these are the ones that translate more word for word. So we have La Biblia de las Américas, which is the one we use the Spanish service. And then on the right side, for English, we have the New American Standard Bible, which is why, somebody here have the English-Spanish Bible? Is that the one you have? And it has both the Biblias de las Américas and New American Standard, right? Why? Because they're both literal. The Bibles that use dynamic equivalents are ones that just translate the message to make it clear and easy to understand. We have en Spanish, Dios habla hoy, traducción en lenguaje actual, Biblias latinoamericanas. And then we have the English one, which is Good News, The Message, and the Living Bible, which I don't recommend any of those three. And then we have the balance between dynamic and formal, and that would be the NIV or the new, La Nueva Traducción Viviente. Have you guys heard of that one? The New Living Translation in English? No? Okay, so that's one that if you read, it sounds just like you would talk, everyday talk. And then here we have a list of the Bibles that are furthest to the left are the most literal, and the Bibles furthest to the right are the less literal of thought for thought translation. So the further you go to the left, the better the translation, most likely. Not necessarily the best translation, but it's going to be more faithful to the original language. how do we know that what we have in our English Bible today is accurate to the original language? Since I don't know if you guys know, we don't have any of the original copies of the Greek New Testament. They've all been lost because they were made out of very cheap material that just disappeared. So the way we know is by doing something that's called textual criticism. And textual criticism is a method used to determine what the original manuscripts of the Bible said. And if we have time, that's a little experiment that we're going to do. We're going to separate in two teams, and I'm going to have you guys do what's called textual criticism. It's going to be pretty interesting, I think. The original manuscripts of the Bible are lost, hidden, or no longer exist. So that is a fact. We don't have the originals. What we have is tens of thousands of copies of the original New Testament manuscripts dating from the 1st century to the 15th century AD, and copies of the Old Testament dating from the 4th century BC to the 15th century AD. In these manuscripts, there are quite a few small differences and some relatively large. Textual criticism is a study of these manuscripts in an effort to determine what was really in the original text. And right here, this is actually an actual copy of a manuscript. This is called Papyrus 52 or P52. And this is probably the oldest copy of the New Testament that we have, which dates between the year 100 and 150. And it contains, both sides contain part of the Gospel of John. It's probably like the size of a credit card. One side contains John 18:31 to 33, and the other one contains verses 37 to 38. So we could actually go back to at least those verses and know whether what we have today in English is accurate to the original, because that's only about 30 years away from the original. And if you were to put it like an overlay over the actual full text, that's how it would look like. But we only have that piece, that brown piece there. This one here is P46, and the P just means papyrus. You guys know what papyrus is, right? You probably learned that in 2nd, 3rd grade. It's the old paper they used to make in kindergarten. So you know what it is, right? Yeah. You could actually make it yourself if you wanted to. So this is this one dates between 175 and 225 and contains most of the epistles of Paul. Contains Romans, Hebrews, Corinthians, Ephesians, Galatians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, but it's missing some portions of each book. So this is just one page of many. That's another page right there. Here we're talking about P66, which is Papyrus 56, and this one dates around the year 200. And this one's an actual book. This is when they actually started making books. You can see there's multiple pages there. And this one contains most of the Gospel of John. It's only missing some portions of it. This was called a codex because it's an actual book. And this one here is P115, and this one's a little further down. It's year 250 to 275, and this one contains the book of Revelation, Revelation 13:18, and actually has the number of the beast there. What's the number of the beast? 666. But you notice something there?
XIC.
Well, right next to that, to the right,
No, it says
in red.
616.
Yeah, it's not 666, huh?
Oh no.
So this is the oldest copy of the book of Revelation, but it's 616. Nobody knows why. I just thought I'd show you. It's a little interesting. But we know the original is 666 because most of the copies have that. There's different theories. Some people think that whoever made this manuscript, this copy, changed the number to match the emperor of Rome during that time, because whoever was the emperor of Rome was considered the beast at that time. Kind of like nowadays, whoever's the next president they always say he's the beast, and then nothing happens and we have the next president. Yeah, kind of like that. So only the facts. In fact, we have 12 2nd century manuscripts, that is, in 100 years of New Testament writing. These manuscripts contain portions of the 4 Gospels, 9 books of Paul, Acts, Hebrews, and Revelation, which compromises the majority of the New Testament books we own today. Once again, no work of antiquity even approaches this early attestation. So we have most of the New Testament within the first 50 years of the life of the apostles. So have you guys ever heard of the phone game? You guys ever play a game in kindergarten where you make a circle and the teacher tells the first person something in the ear and then they have to repeat it to each other in the ear? And what happens by the time it gets to the last person? It's a whole different story, right? So what some of the people say is, well, we don't know what was really written in the original manuscripts of the Bible because they try to use the telephone game saying it was repeated so many times that eventually the original story got lost. But we're going to see how that's not possible based on the way the manuscripts went all over the world and how quickly the copies were made. So the phone game, often the transmission of the New Testament text resembles the phone game we play as children, where a person whispers something in the ears of the next person on the line and so on around the circle until the last person repeats what he has heard, and inevitably change into often humorous ways of what was originally said. But is this an accurate way of thinking about how the New Testament was transmitted over time? So all we have to do is look at a map, because we don't want to go too far in. I actually took 5 Sundays to teach all these things Sunday class. I'm trying to teach all this in just 1 or 2 days here. So the New Testament was written at various locations, right? Some of them in Rome, some of them in different locations by the apostles. Here's the thing, the telephone game theory doesn't work. Why? Because copies quickly within the first 20 years went all over the known world. The Western Byzantine text, we have the Caesarean text and the Alexandrian text. We have found texts of the New Testament in every part of the world. And the amazing part is they all match each other 99.9%. And the only things that do change, we're going to learn later, is just, the way they spell names, the way someone may have misspelled the word, or they may have forgot a period. Little things like that don't change the text or the meaning of anything. So we know that copies were quickly distributed across the known world, and we have the evidence to prove that. So in review, we know that we don't have the original copies of the New Testament, but we do have over 25,000 early manuscripts. That includes 10,000 in Latin, 9,300 in Syrian, Slavic, Gothic, Ethiopian, Coptic, and Armenian. Those are all different languages, just in case you're wondering. 65 manuscripts are in Greek. 99.5% identical in content, being the rest minor variations as spelling. So right now we learn what textual criticism is. We saw some of the first handwritten samples such as P95, 46, 66, and 115. And we learned something about modern translations and how they base their translations on the original Greek. So going back to the map of the various line theories, but the fact of the matter is that no central agency ever existed or could have ever existed. Christianity was a persecuted religion composed mainly of the lowest classes. There was no central authority that could have ever collected all the texts and made wholesale changes. So what this is saying is that since copies went all over the world and Christians were being persecuted for their faith, they were not seen as important during the first 200 years. The emperors, the Rome didn't really care about Christians. They just saw them as, like a cult. So there was no reason for anybody in Rome, any emperor, to get all these manuscripts and change them for whatever reason they wanted to change them, whether it was political reasons or religious reasons. So we know these texts were not changed. Such was impossible in the early days of the transmissions, and since we now have such ancient texts, obviously it could not have happened at a later point without giving clear evidence. In fact, we can prove beyond any doubt that this kind of corruption did not happen, since papyrus have been found dating back to the 2nd century, and that only in the last 100 years, if any centralized organization later tried to alter the text, those later texts would show crude differences, as they were the oldest manuscripts, but just the opposite has been the case. So reliability of the Bible. If the critics of the Bible dismiss the New Testament as authoritative information, then they must also dismiss the reliability of writings of Plato, Aristotle, Caesar, Homer, and other authors. On the other hand, if critics recognize the historicity in writings of these other individuals, then they must also retain the historicity in writings of the New Testament authors. So what this is saying is that we have so many manuscripts of the New Testament dating back to the 1st, 2nd century, mostly 2nd century, that if we're going to say that the Bible is not reliable, then every writing from Plato, Aristotle, Caesar, Homer. Do you guys know who Homer was? Not Homer Simpson. He was a famous poet. Yeah, he lived before Christ. And we have writings of him, and nobody disputes that any of these writings are not reliable. And we're going to see, we're going to compare right now the New Testament with some of these writings. Nobody says that Plato's writings are not reliable, Aristotle, Caesar, Homer, or any other authors of antiquity. But when it comes to the New Testament, we have over 5,600 manuscripts and over 25,000 copies in different languages. The Bible gets attacked and questioned. So see, Plato here. Plato died between 427 and he lived between 427 and 347 BC, right? The latest copy that we have of his writing is from the year 900 after Christ. So that's how many years from his death? 1200, right? 1200 years. And how many copies do we have? Kind of hard to tell here, but it's about 9 copies. So Plato, we have 7 copies of Plato. We have, let's see, Aristotle right down here. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it says 380. He lived between 384 and 322. The latest copy that we have of his is the year 1100 after Christ. That's 1400 years after his death. We don't have any copies between his death and the year 1100. The latest copy is 1400 years after his death. We only have 49 copies. Now, the New Testament, we have how many copies? Just in Greek alone. 5,600 in Greek. The oldest one are less than 100 years from the original, and they're 99.5% identical. Now, how can we ever question the New Testament as being reliable? Do we know what the original copy said? We don't?
Yes.
If we're going to say that Plato's writing and Homer's and Aristotle's writing are reliable, how are we not going to say that about the New Testament when we have, how many, 100 times more copies? And we could actually say, and we know for a fact they're 99.5% identical. Yeah. So the other argument that people say is, but there are too many variations, and variations is differences, errors in copies. Like, so when they read one manuscript of John and then read another manuscript, and then they find differences, that's a variation. And they say, but there's over 400,000 variants. Does that sound like a lot? Sounds like a lot, right? You would wonder, like, why so many differences? But here's what they don't tell you. 99% of all variants do not impact the meaning of the text. Variations in spelling and the order of the word compose the vast majority of the variations. So the majority, 99% of those differences are meaningless. They're just spelling or punctuation errors. Therefore, 1% of 400,000 means that there's actually only 4,000 significant textual variants of 138,162 words, 2.9% or 1 significant variant every 3 pages, but only half of these are viable. Therefore, there are only 1,500 to 2,000 viable, meaningful, and textual variants in the New Testament. So out of the entire Bible, out of all the manuscripts, all the 5,600 manuscripts that we have, there's between 1,500 and 2,000 differences, which is very minor when you're talking about I think it's over 1 million words in the entire Bible. Another thing they don't tell you is the more manuscript you have for a particular work, the more textual variants you will have. So obviously we have so many copies, we're going to find more differences, right? The more copies you have, the more differences you're going to find. There are 5,700 cataloged manuscripts of the New Testament books. That's about 1.3 million pages of great total text. So out of 1.3 million pages of New Testament manuscripts, we only have between 1,500 to 2,000 variations. So now we're going to go find out how is it that we can actually rely and know that those variations are meaningless and that we could actually rely in our English Bible that it's accurate to the original, what the apostles wrote. So, as you can see, that part didn't get translated. So there's three methods of textual criticism. And right now we're going to find out what textual criticism is with the experiment that we're going to do. There are three main methods for textual criticism. The first is the Textus Receptus. Have you guys ever heard of the Textus Receptus? Who here has heard of the Reina Valera? You never heard of Reina Valera? You guys know what the Reina Valera is, right? The Bible, the Spanish Bible? Okay. Have you heard of the King James Bible? Okay. Well, both the Reina Valera and the King James Bible were translated from the Textus Receptus. And the Textus Receptus was a manuscript of the Bible that was compiled by a man named Desiderius Erasmus, and that's him in the picture, in the year 1500. He took a limited number of manuscripts to which he had access and compiled them into what eventually became known as the Textus Receptus. So at the time that Desiderius Erasmus lived, he only had about 5 or 6 copies of the New Testament. Now we have how many? We mentioned that number like 10 times already. 5,600, right? So now we have 5,600. He only had, at that time, only about 5 or 6 copies existed. And what he did was he got those 6 copies, he compared them and made one edition. So he found all the similarities, he found all the errors, and he came up with an edition of the New Testament in Greek. And the King James and the Reina Valera, especially the older version of the Reina Valera, are completely translated from the Textus Receptus. And that's the reason a lot of people are going away from the Reina Valera. And I don't know if you know, in English, a lot of people don't even use the King James anymore because it was translated from a very small collection of Greek texts. There's another method called the majority text. A second method is known as the majority text. The majority text takes all the manuscripts that are available today, compares the differences, and chooses the most appropriate, correct text based on the most repeated text. For example, if 748 manuscripts say he said, and 1,429 manuscripts say they said, the majority text chooses the phrase they said as the most credible original text. There are no major Bible translations based on the majority text. So the majority text, what it does is it looks at the different Greek texts, and wherever there's a difference, it goes with the one that's used the most. So for example, right here, if 10 copies of the Old Testament, of the New Testament say he said, and 20 copies says they said on a verse, what are they going to go with? Why? Because there's more copies, right? But is that the best way to determine the original? Why not? Because what? We have to go based on the age of the copies that you have too. So let's say we have 20 copies of the New Testament, of the book of John. We have 20 copies of the book of John, and only 5 of those are from the 2nd century. They're only within 50 years of the life of the apostles. And then you have 15 copies, and these are from the year 1200. And these 50 copies say they said, but the oldest one, which are less copies, say he said. Which ones are more reliable? The older 5 copies that are closer to the original, or the newer copies that are more copies, but they're further away from the original? Why? Because they're closer to the original. Yeah. Right. So you're not going to go with the majority. You're going to go with what's closer to the original copies, right? So most modern translations use what's called critical or eclectic method. The third method is known as critical eclectic method. The eclectic method implies considering the internal and external evidence to determine the most credible original text. The external evidence leads us to ask the questions: how many manuscripts does the text appear in? What are the dates of these manuscripts? In what region of the world were these manuscripts found? The evidence leads us to ask the question: what would have caused these different texts? Which readings may perhaps explain the original of the other text? So as you can see, when they do the method where they go with the oldest, depending on, they also go based on the location that they found the text, the further away it is from the original location, tells you that there could have been a little bit more changes because of the distance that it had to travel. So this is more of a scientific method of translating the Bible and determining what the original language said. So anybody here, what do you have? You have the NIV, right? So that's using the critical eclectic text. You have the NASB, also uses this method, but the Reina Valera uses this method. But if you compare, is there that much of a difference? If you're reading the Reina Valera on one side and you're reading the New American Standard Bible on the other side, and you read them side to side, well, actually, no, you have La Biblia de las Américas on yours, right? Right, yeah. But even when you read the Reina Valera, you're not going to find that many differences where it's going to make a difference when it comes to doctrine. So right now we're going to look at a couple verses, and that's where we're going to see the difference between the Textus Receptus, remember the first one we talked about, and the eclectic modern ways of determining what the original said. So nobody here has a King James version. Do you have a King on your phone? No? Okay. And then we have the ESV, which is this Bible here on the right-hand side, and we're going to compare. So the King James Version says, "This is he that came with water and blood, even Jesus Christ, not by water only, but by water and blood. And it is the Spirit that beareth witness, because the Spirit is truth. For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness in earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these three agree in one." Now we're going to read the ESV side. "This is he who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not by the water only, but by the water and the blood, and the Spirit is the one who testifies, because the Spirit is the truth." So we can see the first portion reads identical, right? When we go to verse 7, what does the ESV say? What does the KJV say on 7? Is there a difference? Big difference, right? The KJV points to the Trinity, right? It's like there you can see the Trinity. You can see, "For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one." There's an obvious, clear verse for the Trinity. But yeah, in First John on the ESV, we have, "For there are three that testify," but you don't see the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. Now the question is, does it make a huge difference?
No.
Does it make a huge difference? Well, the question we should be asking ourselves is, do we want to know what the King James translator put in the Bible? Or do we want to know what John wrote? Right? We don't want to go on tradition. And that was a problem for hundreds of years. We were going by tradition. Well, this is what the church had for so many centuries. But after more research and study, doing textual criticism, we know that in the original text, we don't have the way the King James Version has it, or the older Reina Valera has it. And how do we know that? By comparing the different documents that we have, we know that what they did was called interpolation. Interpolation means that a scribe, you guys know what a scribe is? You ever heard of that word before, a scribe? It's a scribe. It was a person who made copies of documents. Yeah. So looking at the text, and I don't have the actual copy here, but looking at the manuscripts that we have, you could actually see where the scribes, at a certain point in history, did what's called interpolation. They added these notes. It would kind of be, who here has a study Bible? You have a study Bible, right? But not with you. Okay. What do study Bibles have? They have commentary, right? Well, somebody at a later time, in order to explain what "for there are three that testify" means, he put a note between the margins that said, "For there are three that bear record," and he added, "In heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one." So it's basically just a note that one of the scribes added in order to add more clarity to what the verse was talking about. So what happened was that scribe added that note, and when he gave it to another scribe, what did that scribe do?
Changed it, right?
Well, he just wrote it the way he saw it.
Oh, okay.
So he was writing it. He saw that, and he didn't know it was an interpolation, or he didn't know it was a note from a scribe. He kept writing. He kept making the copy as if it was part of the Bible. What does yours have, Class?
There are 3 that testify.
And that's it, right? And what does the Biblia de las Américas put on the Spanish side?
On the Spanish one,
Mhm.
7%, porque 3 son los que dan testimonio en la tierra.
See that? So la Biblia de las Américas went with the Textus Receptus. Why? I don't know why. When no other modern translation uses that anymore. And I think they just did it more of tradition. It's just people are used to reading it. And sometimes, depending on the Bible, you actually see footnotes where it tells you that verse 7, the way it's written, it's not part of the earliest manuscripts. It gives you a little note on the bottom. I'm not sure if that Bible has it.
Maybe on the study one.
Yeah, maybe the study one would have it, yeah. And when this guy here, let me go back. There is Erasmus. When he was making his text, the Textus Receptus, which includes that verse, his first 2 editions, he didn't include it. He said, if I don't see it on one of the original texts or one of the manuscripts that we have, I'm not going to add it because there's no evidence that it was there. Obviously, which church was in control during this time? The Catholic Church, right? They were in control of all the manuscripts. Magically, a manuscript appeared with that verse, and then later on he added it, which ended up in the King James Bible. Now we're going to talk about another verse. Oh, just one more quick note here. The text appears for the first time in certain Latin texts in the 4th century. So that's like 300 years after Christ. More likely as an explanation of the Spirit, water, and blood. Although it is found in some Greek manuscripts of the 10th and 11th century, it is only written on the margins in one hand from the 16th and 17th century. The following manuscripts are the only ones containing the verse in the actual Greek text of the Greek manuscript. So these are the only copies that exist that have that verse in Greek. And that's the latest one the earliest one is the 14th century. So as you can see, it's like 1,300 years away from the originals. If that verse existed at some point before that, we have so many copies dating back further than that it would be in one of those older copies. And now this one here is probably even a little bit more interesting. You know the story of the adulterous woman that was going to get stoned? You guys, I think everybody knows that story, right? And Jesus came, he marked the line, and he reproved the Jews that were trying to kill her. So this right here says, this story, beloved by his revelation of God's mercy to sinners, is only found in John. It was almost certainly not part of John's original gospel. You have an NIV, right? All right, go to John 7:53. Yeah, try to find it on yours, see if it's on the New American Standard Bible. And on the Spanish version too. John 7:53. Can't find it?
It's in the New Testament, right?
Yeah. You guys find it?
Yeah.
John 7:53 to 8 to 11. Wait, hold on. I think I may have it wrong here. I have an NIV right here. Mostly you can't find it, huh?
It's the one before Acts?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
If you can't find it, that's fine. You're not supposed to find it. It's not in NIV.
Oh, no?
No. That was the whole idea of asking you to look for it.
I was like, where is it at?
So if you look at the NIV right here,
Yeah.
and if you look at any other modern translation, including the ESV, I'm not sure if yours has it. Right after 52, John 7:52, it says, the earliest manuscripts and many other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53, 8 to 11. A few manuscripts include these verses, wholly or in part, after John 7:36. So why don't they put it in here? Because there's no evidence that it was ever in the originals. Such a popular story that everybody talks about. You see it on every Jesus movie, right? Every Jesus movie makes sure they put that scene but the evidence doesn't show that it was ever there. So this says right here, the earliest and most reliable manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53, 8-11. That is, the first Greek manuscripts, the first translation, and the first letter of the church fathers lack reference to the story. And there's another thing, when we want to know if something was in the original, we don't even have to go to the Greek manuscripts. You could actually go back to the early fathers, the first 300-400 years, because in their commentaries, basically what they say is that if we were to lose every copy of the 5,600 manuscripts that we have in Greek, we could still recover the New Testament through the commentaries of the early church fathers. You could actually pull every Bible verse and have the majority of the Bible, and none of them ever mention this Bible verse. It says, in addition, some manuscripts place it in other points. So some manuscripts actually have it in other location. Others include it in the Gospel of Luke, placing it after Luke 21:38. And many manuscripts have marks that indicate that the scribes were aware that it lacks satisfactory credentials. In addition, it contains many expressions that are more similar to those of the synoptic Gospels than those of John. Now, let me ask you this. Does it make you question, if that Bible verse isn't there and it's always been in the Bible until recently, does it make you question the reliability of the Bible?
It is there, now I can rely on the Bible.
Right. But the reason I want to show this is because I want to show you that you can rely on the Bible. Why? Because we could go back to the manuscripts, the 5,600 copies we have, and the 25,000 copies, and know for a fact that this Bible verse isn't supposed to be there, and we know what is supposed to be there. There's no reason to question it. This should actually give you more faith that what we have in the Bible is what the actual apostles wrote. And sometimes what happens with us is that we want to go based on tradition. Some people would say, no, I want to keep that in my Bible. Why? Because it's a nice story to hear. It's a good story to tell. But as Christians, we're supposed to care about what the actual apostles wrote, not what tradition tells us what was in the Bible. And just so we can see what most of the errors consist of, for example, in the KJV, and when I say errors, I'm just talking about differences, not errors. That word is probably not the right word to use. In the KJV, in 1 John 3:1, it says, "Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the word beknoweth us not, because it knew him not." Now we know why we don't read the King James anymore, right? The word says LBLA, that's supposed to be the ESV actually. It says, "See what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God, and so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him." What difference do you guys see there? Well, there's the bottom one, the ESV. It has a couple extra words. It's and so we are. Right after we should be called children of God, the bottom one says, "So we are." You see that? So we are. But this one, the KJV doesn't have it. That would be considered a variation. That's what people would call errors in the Bible. Does that make a difference? No, right? Does that change doctrine? So the 1,500 to 2,000 variations they talk about, what I'm trying to tell you is that there's going to be a time where you're going to be talking to somebody, sharing the gospel, and they're going to bring up, well, how do you know what the Bible says? They're going to say, well, there's a lot of contradictions, there's a lot of errors, there's a lot of variations. But they're just repeating that because that's what they heard. But they don't know what they're talking about. When they're talking about variations, that's what we're talking about. So when they're talking about 1,500 to 2,000 variations out of 5,600 manuscripts, we're talking about something so simple as this. It doesn't change the message at all. And another thing they're going to tell you is, well, how do you know which version of the Bible is the correct one? And when they're saying that is, well, some people have the NIV, some people have the KJV, some people have the NASB. How do you know what's the correct one? Again, that tells you that they don't know what they're talking about. Because each translation is translated from what? From the Greek. And why do they all sound different sometimes when they translate? It's just translation methods. If I was to give you guys a copy right now of something written in English, and I asked every one of you to make a copy of that in Spanish, would every single one of you translate it exactly the same? No, right? Because we all have, first we have a different level of vocabulary, and we all speak different. So we're going to write it the way we think. So the translation team of the, for example, the ESV used a certain method, a certain technique to translate compared to the KJV people who use an older, a different style of English and a different style of translation. So in review, 99% of those 400,000 copies are meaningless. Of those errors, of those variants are meaningless, means absolutely nothing. Copies were scattered all over the world quickly without controlling authority. So there was never a central government or person who could have got all those copies from all over the world and made a change. If they did make a change, we would notice it in the copies. Any errors can be easily identified and excluded as being original. We can trust any modern translation that is faithful to the original languages because of the mass amount of data that we have. We can know that we have the original, we know what the original copy said. Yeah, and this should give you more confidence. Like that verse that I gave about the adulterous woman, I didn't show it to make you question the Bible. I made it so you can know how accurately we can know what the actual Bible said, that we know so much that we could actually say that shouldn't be in the Bible. And as Christians, we're not afraid to say, okay, this here should not be in the Bible. Because we go based on facts. We go based on reality. If the manuscripts don't show that that's in the Bible, should Christians want it in the Bible? No, right? And that's why the NIV translators don't have it. The ESV translators don't have it. But we still see that some modern translations still keep it just because tradition, it's a good story to tell. And some people actually believe the story was actually it did happen. And it was a story that was told across the Christian community, and eventually that's why it ended up in the Bible. But if that's not what John wrote, then we shouldn't have it in there.